Judicial Watch is fighting in court right now for access to the Senate records, and we're encouraging finally Congress to follow our lead, and sometimes they do, in getting access to this. Also this week, we had more developments in the ongoing saga of the classified document issue as it relates to former and current presidents and vice presidents. Now, again, to go back to the beginning, the Biden administration, in an unprecedented and abusive fashion, raided the home of Donald Trump. First time in American history anything like that has happened, allegedly to uncover and get classified records that he may have been storing in his home in Mar-a-Lago. Now, the legal issue is whether any records that he had with him were actually classified, even though they were marked classified. And as Judicial Watch has pointed out, because we were litigating this issue. Judicial Watch has over 30 years, or nearly 30 years, I think it's fair to say, in litigating federal government records issues, especially issues as it relates to White House documents. I began working at Judicial Watch, I was just telling my colleagues here, way back in 1998. And I remember one of the first legal fights that, Judicial Watch was engaged in, at least when I first started here, was with the Clinton White House about records and whether we could gain access to White House records and the nature of them and executive privilege concerns and such. So we've been fighting this longer than many of you have been alive. And on top of that, we had a specific lawsuit over the Clinton sock drawer tapes, as the case has become famously known. And that was an author who had recorded Bill Clinton in interviews, but also in making phone calls and basically engaging in the act of being president, talking to a foreign leader, at least one foreign leader, talking to members of Congress, all presidential activities, the recordations of which typically would be presidential records. And the recordation of a phone call with a foreign leader typically would be a classified record. And we saw that and said, well, the archives, aren't you supposed to get these records? He's gone. Get him. The report, he has them in his sock drawer or kept them there. And the archives said, no, we don't have to get them. The Justice Department said, no, they don't have to get them. A federal court judge in the preeminent case on the issue of presidential records said, no. The president has the right to decide what are presidential records and what are classified records. And frankly, no one can second guess them. And and certainly not the archives, whose only job is to maintain the records. They're not some sort of Inspector Javert who gets to go out there and start collecting records because they think a president might have them and hounding them. The Justice Department told the court in our case, if a president has records after he leaves office, they're presumptively personal. And the court said the Presidential Records Act, there's no other way to interpret it than to provide deference to the president as deciding whether or not he keeps records or what he takes with him, essentially. And under the Presidential Records Act, the vice president, to bring it forward, has the same sorts of power. So, despite what you might hear from some folks who quite fairly question, the hypocrisy of the Biden administration here, we're being consistent. Vice President Biden at the time had the same power under the law President Trump did to take records with him under the Presidential Records Act, because those records would necessarily include classified records. So it's a little more complex than some are making it out to be. But there is no doubt that records from his time in the Senate that are classified aren't protected by anything we're talking about here. And that, to me, is the most significant risk for Biden. But of course, the other risk is that his Justice Department changed all the rules. I told you what their prior position was, to protect Bill. But they threw out the rule book to target Trump. And as a result, they ensnared Biden. Now I see reports that Pence had to search his home and he found some classified records, and that the FBI will search. And then, of course, there was another FBI search, I think, over last weekend, at least it was reported over the weekend, in his home in Wilmington, and then in his beach home subsequently. That's what I read. And of course, Biden still got special treatment that Trump didn't get. Remember, Trump said to the FBI, DOJ officials who visited his home, he said, you know, you're free to look at these records. His people said, look at these records if you want to look through them. And they said, no, no, no. And then they raided his home and they kept all the lawyers out. And when it came to Biden, no raid. Certainly the FBI showed up, and I guess there was a threat of subpoena, but there was no subpoena. There's no grand jury. And they're slow walking the search for and disclosures of those searches of classified information. Remember, this is the Biden administration, and his team is engaged in the modified limited hangout approach to disclosures here. And go back and look up, have a little fun history jog on the internet by looking up the basis or the phrase modified limited hangout. It goes back to the Nixon era. You know, just you release enough, it's bad news, but there's always more bad news. You don't want to release it all at once, and yet it's the limited hangout. And that's what's going on here, a very Nixonian approach by the Biden administration. So as I highlighted, the issue is I think the most significant issue is the records that Biden has up in the Senate, or from his Senate days up in Delaware. He came to a secret deal with the University of Delaware to maintain and house his records, and he's hiding them from the American people. The deal allegedly requires the University of Delaware to keep the records secret until at least 2 years after he leaves political office. So that means, for practical purposes, we won't see if this deal is followed, and for instance, President Biden is reelected, records until, what's today? Today is we're in 2023, 24, 28, 2030. That's when we're going to have no more carbon in the world, right? Thanks to all these electric vehicles, and we'll have the Senate records. How do you think that's going to turn out? Well, on either case, I get distracted, right? So, needless to say, Judicial Watch is unsatisfied with that and has been dissatisfied. And Judicial Watch and the Daily Caller News Foundation has been suing since 2020, nearly 3 years, for these records. We not only want the records, but we also want the secret deal that created this scheme to keep this information away from the American people. And the University of Delaware is partially and significantly funded by state tax dollars there, and we think this open records law applies. And so we've been fighting for those records. And why is this important, or as even more important than it was, let's say 2 months ago? Because now, as a result of these searches, it turns out Biden had classified records from his days in the Senate. And so the presumption is, if he had classified records from his days in the Senate in his glove box, in his little Corvette, in his locked garage, I'm making fun, but he obviously had those records in his home there, up in Delaware. Why wouldn't there be classified records up in the University of Delaware? Why isn't the FBI raiding? And so that's something we want to know. And we're not going to wait for Congress. We're not going to wait for the FBI. We've been pushing strongly and directly in the courts with some limited success, losing some, winning some, to try to kind of pry loose the information in order to pry loose the documents about Biden's Senate career. And as I've highlighted from the beginning about this case, Joe Biden was on the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, and Biden boasted of that. He talked about how he knew Putin or met Putin back when he was a senator. And I presume, as head of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, I mean, you may not know this about Congress, certainly the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee or the Foreign Affairs Committee, people like getting on committees like that because they get to travel on your dime to foreign countries to investigate foreign affairs. Now, I'm not saying all of that is a waste, but you can imagine it's probably not an awful trip they're taking when they go abroad to investigate many of these places for the American people. So as a result, they have to be briefed on sensitive topics that they're even though the president represents us in foreign affairs, as you know, the senators and congressmen, when they travel, necessarily touch base with the administration, and they're endeavoring typically to speak as one voice. So they gotta have to know what's going on, and that involves classified briefings and access to those materials. So that's where Biden likely gained access to classified information. And I'm not quite sure what other committees he served on when he was in the Senate, but certainly the Foreign Affairs Committee kind of screams out to me as one through which he would have gained access to classified records. I was speaking to someone, a reporter, and the reporter was thinking that maybe, and he didn't know for sure, but his understanding of the issue was that maybe the records weren't necessarily classified, per se, in the sense that they were marked classified, but his records from his days as vice president that were classified upon review. So it's a record that's not marked as classified, but when you're reviewing it and someone who knows classified versus unclassified material, when they see it, so, oh no, this is classified. This is based off a classified record. This is a note related to a classified record. He was reading a document. He was taking notes from a record or a briefing, and the notes should never have been removed from the United States Senate. So no matter how you slice it, whether they are documents that were marked classified or documents that were unmarked as classified that necessarily someone like either then Senator Biden should have known or others knew were classified. And that's what the story is. And are there more records like that up in Delaware? Why hasn't the FBI been up there? I was talking to a reporter, or I was interviewing with our friend, what was it? Was it Vince Colonese? I don't know if I talked about this on the last update. I feel like I did. Well, I'm going to talk about it again because you probably didn't see the last update or don't remember the fact I talked about it. And I made a bet, a rhetorical bet. I said, I bet the FBI, it's not a matter of if, but when the FBI is going to search the University of Delaware records. And Vince smartly rejoined that, I tell you what, I'm betting they already have, and we'll find out about it soon. So I think that's a fair analysis as well. So we'll see what happens there, but we're pushing for the records. We have this lawsuit. The government doesn't want to give us access to the Senate records at this time. One of the issues is that whether the government funding is being used to maintain the Senate records, and one of the ways we can figure that out and maybe break through that current hurdle is what the deal is and how the records are being maintained, and whether that deal and the maintenance of those records, or the deal reflects how those records are being maintained, whether with or without private versus government funds. Because the theory is if government funds are being used to maintain these records, then we should gain access to them. And I'm greatly simplifying it, mostly because I'm not a lawyer and I only understand it in a simple way, but I think I'm getting it right. And just so that you know, we just filed, because what's interesting here is the University of Delaware is desperate to avoid disclosing the nature of the agreement and the nature of the funding of of the maintenance of the Senate records for Joe Biden. And I'm trying to describe, let me just summarize this in an easy way. The court at the lower level just took at face value that, oh, they say they're not funding any record. They're not funding it. And we said, well, they didn't provide any evidence to the court for which the court could make a reliable decision. So we appealed it. And the court at the appellate level said, the Judicial Watch is right. This is Delaware. This is Biden's home state. You need to go back and get more information from the university as to how this is funded, a little bit more elucidation. And so that happened. And they came back again with basically a declaration by an official that said, well, I talked to the budget person, and he said, no, it's only private funding. Well, where are the records? What do you mean? Did you look at the budget? Did you look at the, quote, the receipts? And again, the lower court just took that hook, line, and sinker, we think, inappropriately. And so we appealed again, and we're saying, look, we've been through this again. Why can we just question someone? And so that's where we are. We're arguing this case before the appellate court, demanding for court, I shouldn't say demand, you're asking a court, for testimony on that secret university deal with Joe Biden to hide Senate records. And forgive me for the detail here, but this is what we have to deal with at Judicial Watch. I get to, come on and say, oh, we got these documents. Well, a lot a lot of heavy lifting goes into getting those documents, whatever they are. It's federal litigation, fighting. In the case of Delaware, it's literally years of litigation to argue whether they're going to even tell us information about what they're up to with this secret deal and scheme. And now the public interest is heightened because of the secret nature of not only Biden's records, but the idea that there's classified records there. So there's even increased public interest. And I don't know if we can bring that to the attention of the court in this context, but I'm sure the court generally is aware of it. So we've got this fight ongoing. But separately, our lawyer, and this is from our most recent filing, despite FOIA's acknowledgement that, quote, public entities as instruments of government should not have the power to decide what is good for the public to know, over the multi-year course of this FOIA proceeding, the university's efforts to satisfy its statutory burden of proof have been parceled out piecemeal in minuscule increments and only in response to court orders entered after briefing by appellants, Judicial Watch and the Daily Caller News Foundation. When the shortcomings of the university's efforts were noted in briefing, the university calls foul. The university's umbrage at these proceedings is misplaced. To date, the FOIA coordinator's efforts and her recollection of what steps she took remains untested by cross-examination. We have every right to challenge what they believe has been a lackluster, what we believe has been a lackluster effort by the university to satisfy its statutory burden. So what they're saying is, how dare Judicial Watch question the assurances of this official that there are no public financing of this operation. And we're saying, well, there are certain standards of proof that have to be met. We have every right to raise questions about whether those standards have been met. And so this is a significant fight. And I tell you, credit to the Daily Caller News Foundation, a really heroic journalist group here in D.C. We worked with them on a number of cases. But where's the rest of the media on this? I said we began suing in 2020. I don't remember when we first started asking for the records, but probably in the beginning of 2020, if not. So if we started suing July 2020, we were suing even before Biden won. I mean, that shows you how prescient we are. We know where to look for information, especially if the president at the time, then candidate Biden, extolling his experience as a senator. We're like, well, where are the records and why won't you release them? And in addition to the foreign policy issue, he had these scandal issues related to Tara Reade and other allegations of harassment potentially that might be referenced in these records. So there are many reasons to gain access to these records. And obviously the other reason now is that they could have classified records, and certainly law enforcement needs to take a look. Because as I said earlier, there's no out here. These aren't records protected as a result of his being president, or he had a right to them because he was vice president. There's no arguments that we've highlighted as it relates to Trump and frankly some of the vice president's records, or then Vice President Biden's records. So our lawyer in this matter up in Delaware, he separately, it wasn't on behalf of us, but he separately sent a letter intended for House leadership encouraging them to follow Judicial Watch's lead and the Daily Caller Foundation's lead and get a hold of these records immediately. And I'm going to quote a little bit from Mr. Catilia's letter. Ted Catilia is our lawyer up in Delaware. Based on what we have learned, there are 1,850 boxes of documents and 415 gigabytes of electronic records. To place this in perspective, we have described the amount of boxes alone as filling approximately 2 tractor-trailer trucks. So that's how much, that's the quantity of Senate records that Biden has hidden away, squirreled away up there in the University of Delaware. Where are the funds coming from to house and archive the Biden records? We have heard rumors that comments on a draft of the gift agreement may have been located on the Hunter Biden laptop, raising further questions. Why would Hunter Biden be commenting on the donation of the Biden records, and what was his role with respect to the donation? Right? Fair question. In our view, the United States House of Representatives would have the power to subpoena all these documents. Unlike an effort to obtain public disclosure of documents under FOIA, a subpoena would have the power to compel the release of these documents. We believe that given President Biden's alleged mishandling of documents, it is imperative for the House to review the Biden records to determine that no classified materials are there, especially given the fact that we don't even know if the person or persons reviewing these documents have security clearance. Think about that. Who in Delaware at the university has a security clearance to review these records? You know, the presumption is there has to be more classified records there if you're being safe, right? The House should also be interested in who has funded what is obviously a substantial donation. With the gift agreement out of reach, there remains an unanswered concern, or this remains an unanswered concern. Finally, the House should also have particular interest in who has had access to the Biden documents. Even if we were able to obtain access to the Biden records, we have no idea if there have been documents removed during the course of our Delaware litigation. Great letter. And as our client mentions in this release, the University of Delaware's conduct through this case totally reeks. The American people have a right to know what's in President Biden's Senate records and why the university is stonewalling our legitimate records request. So says the Daily Caller News Foundation managing editor, Michael Bastish. And as I commented, Congress should follow Judicial Watch's lead and immediately move to subpoena, secure, and examine the trove of secret Biden Senate records being held in the University of Delaware. Judicial Watch, in the meantime, will continue fighting in court to overcome the university's desperate secrecy over its deal with Biden to keep these secret records away from the American people. So Judicial Watch is fighting in court right now for access to the Senate records, and we're encouraging finally Congress to follow our lead, and sometimes they do in getting access to this. I know sometimes Congress asks, well, how can Judicial Watch get these records when Congress can't? It's because we sue for them in court. Congress rarely does, and Republicans in Congress even more so. So I'm hoping the new Republican majority in the House is newly emboldened as a result of Judicial Watch's leadership and the urgency of the corruption of Joe Biden to try to get to the bottom of this scandal. So stay tuned. We'll report back as information comes up. So to be clear, this whole issue began with this abuse of Trump, and it has led quickly to even more disclosures about additional criminal activity by Joe Biden. So in many ways, this is quite an extraordinary series of events over the last several months, but it's really quite typical of the deep state left-wing abuse of Trump, using the rule of law or misusing the tools of law, frankly, to target President Trump. Usually what they're accusing him of, they've done worse in spades. And where he's actually innocent, they're guilty. We saw that with Russia, with Hillary, and the Obama administration working with Russians to target Trump while accusing him of improperly working with Russians. And now we know that he's being accused falsely, based on law and precedent and prior Justice Department positions, of mishandling documents, while in fact Joe Biden, in the least from his days as a senator, has been caught red-handed mishandling classified records, and yet he's still being protected. So this scandal continues, and Judicial Watch, again, is in the center of the effort to disclose it, or at the tip of the spear in the effort to disclose it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like our video down below.